I have a nice view where I am in this apartment in Skopje, Macedonia, but when I try to position the camera to, share the view, it's just the lighting, I guess, the way it interacts with the camera. Yeah, it's a disaster. It's just like a washout glare. Yeah, it looks really bad. But just wanted to comment on, some debates I've seen, basically on Facebook. The Zionists, the NSA, have banned me from Twitter for being violently anti-fascist, liberal, reactionary, further right, I would call it. I have to see if I can log in under a different handle and email. But yeah, anytime you start to become relevant or have an actual revolutionary point of view, these fucking right-wing bastards, whether that be liberal or, so-called MAGA, they ban you. They can't ban you fast enough. Anyway, so I may post this on YouTube and share this on Facebook, and who knows. But there's, I guess, been a debate because President was saying, he was saying, I'm going to, sweep the streets of, all these homeless, most of whom are mentally ill, and, some Facebook friends are like, well, yeah, that's long overdue, good. I think there does need to be some order, in the cities. It's such a complicated question. Like where to start on the issue, really. America is, it's a giant mess. Coming from Chicago, the history of, I guess, the homeless and the mentally ill and the drug addicts, those who ran the city, the machine, versus, what I would call the super liberals, the putative left. Back in the day, Richard M. Daley, I guess it was, and mostly, and probably, what is it, Richard J, the father, and then Richard M. also, would release, basically violently mentally ill people into Helen Schiller's ward. I think that was Ward 46. When you had like leftist hillbillies and even, some of the black left, I guess you could call them, up in Uptown, mostly hillbillies, I guess, and, other whatever, super liberals, Maoists, putatively left, people organizing in the community. That was, the day of the heyday, I guess, of the real community organizers. Wasn't around for it, so, I don't know a lot about it, but I once met, Helen Schiller's son, through the Green Party, an event they had. I guess they wanted to meet some of us, and, wasn't impressed at that point. They were just basically Democrats with extra steps and, not very honest, but, they were also battling a nasty, brutal, dishonest political machine in Chicago that was, Mafia tied, and, absolutely awful. God, I should have gotten out of Chicago in 1996 if I had had the resources. And that's the other part of the the discussion is, many, as another, friend pointed out, Niels pointed out, he kind of chose to be a lumpen, I guess, a crust punk for a number of years, and then, kind of left that life, was rescued, whatever, met someone who he could relate to and got married to, and I guess maybe he had kids, I'm not sure. But, he was pointing out, well, And others were saying, well, okay, you get some idiot who does drugs for the thrill of it, and then they become homeless, and then they burn all their bridges through becoming an addict. And also, though, at the same time, maybe they're mentally ill. And what but the drugs exacerbate that. But the other issue is capitalism. When you live in a society where it's all against all, and the only end in society practically is just accumulating money and status. I see that all over traveling, right? Like, uh, you know, what there's a tension. You see it very well, especially with the younger generation, because they're trying to establish themselves, or they're more active and dynamic. Or you go to a cafe and they're there, and you observe their behavior, of a number of them. I mean, I saw this especially in, like, St. Petersburg or Moscow, where you have these stupid young strivers come in from the village, and they want to be the next Elon Musk. And that's their orientation. Or I was in Havana and I was talking to some high school kids at some government event. I'm like, hey kids, what do you think of Cuba and the revolution and socialism? And they were like, well, honestly, mister, everyone here wants to become a businessman, and no one wants to become a teacher or doctor because it doesn't pay anything. But you can't have a country without people becoming teachers and doctors. And that's the point. Is that sort of like, congratulations to all of the anti-communist liberals and right-wing schmucks in the West. You won. But then what did you win? You won. You have now built a society, especially in the last 35 years, that is massively alienated. And the mental illness has followed along with that, and the antisocial behavior. I mean, your whole fucking societies is one giant model of antisocial behavior based on the accumulation of wealth. Freaks like Bezos or Musk are held up to be emulated, while people who choose to become teachers, or even doctors, well, at least in normal countries outside of the U.S., and maybe even somewhat in the U.S., they're derided, they're attacked. My people with my politics were absolutely beyond the pale. The teachers I worked with at, like, Evanston Township High School around the year 2000, 80% of them were schmucks, right-wing schmucks. 20% were very cool and reflective and intellectual, but the other 80% were just there for the paycheck. And they were just, a lot of them are just right-wing trash, Irish, or Bohawk, or Polak, or whatever, just trash. So in an environment like that, where everything is oriented towards the accumulation of individual wealth, and fucking anyone who has a social impulse, in closing down like a common space where people could, like, meet and discuss and have a normal interaction. Is it any wonder that the cities are just a cesspool of dysfunctional, crazy behavior and drug taking? It's just so awful. And I've met Belaruskis. There are many youth who leave Belarus because they can't handle how conservative it is. And it's not a model of dynamism, really. And in the end, it's basically, again, like a young friend I met in Belarus and stayed with. He worked in one of the combine factories. He said to me, the class consciousness is in the toilet. I mean, you still see, though, in Belarus, you ride around Minsk and people are, the atmosphere and the people, are very civilized and very, I don't know how to put it, just so, it's like going to Minsk. In a way, it's too polluted, but it's on another level, it's kind of beautiful because it recalls, 30, 40, 50 years ago when, the liberals and the capitalists had, not yet been able to destroy, corrode and destroy absolutely everything. Belarus is diminished, I'm sure, from what it was 50 years ago. The social relations are more alienated, obviously, but you can go to like the workers' canteen and just the atmosphere of people like just talking calmly, and it's hard to describe, but it's there's more of a kind of human interaction between people. The government and the people do not tolerate jackasses and aggressive, assholes the way they do in other countries. And the accumulating wealth just to accumulate wealth is looked down upon, and those people are just told to fuck off, basically. Stupider younger people who want to accumulate wealth or want excitement. I guess that's part of being young. You want, excitement. But, on the other hand, because the working class has, no consciousness hardly. Like, it's even worse than the U.S. in Belarus, that there's no dynamic driving force in Belarus to really improve the society. The society maintains, and by comparison, it's so much more you don't have this disintegration. You don't have this kind of the same sorts of acting out and mental illness, and drugs are, they're, one joint they find on you crossing the border, you can go to prison for 10 years in Belarus. They absolutely do not tolerate drug use in Belarus. You can drink vodka, and unfortunately there's alcoholism, but I think I believe that's been declining as well in the recent last 10 years, as the country becomes more prosperous. But still, to be critical, intellectual about it, there's Belarus does lack, excuse me, and of course Russia does too, that kind of revolutionary dynamism. Excuse me, coffee. The revolutionary dynamism and rationality, I guess, from what you would get from like a kind of conscious working class movement, as the yoga types say, self-actualized. It is not self-actualized. It's still, I think the masses still to an extent ape or have regard, maybe less and less so, because now they see what the West is really about, which is theft and murder. How can you miss that being next to Ukraine? But anyway, so and then the other thing I was going to say is, I should say, so basically in a place like Belarus, you can see something of an alternative model. There are people there, layers there, that want to preserve, some of that Soviet life, some of the best aspects of it, the humanist parts. Yeah, and the prices are not out of control generally. I mean, they're rising, but still. And like rank speculation, well, it's there's deterioration. The prices are going up, prices of housing are going up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not paradise by any means, but you can feel in the atmosphere there. It's one of the best countries to live in, if you like peasant countries. And for myself, it gets very complicated with the history of my family there, and myself, in terms of my politics. But it is uh, it is in some ways a model compared to certainly the Hitler Freedom Land America. And then getting back to the issue of, like Pres Don is saying, well, we have to have, bring back the mental institutions. And to one extent, I can agree with that. I mean, I remember in the 80s when Reagan and those freaks released the mentally ill onto the streets. And, I was told and saw, how Daley, the father and the son, did that. And they used it as a weapon. They still do, against, any sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, like left, let's call them left liberal movements, basically, against, right wing liberalism or right wing, I don't know, right wing populism. Would you call Richard J. Daley? Possibly, I guess. Yeah. But as I always say, you also have to look at the 200 years of trash importation that is Hitler Freedom Land America, and the absolute scum in my experience of 50 plus years. You're talking about Banderovci Ukrainians, anti-Semitic Polacks, fascist honkies, Hungarians, some of the worst fascist Asian Americans, like 90%, fascist, backward, gay liberal Nazis. I met there's one awful bitch at Evanston Township High School, Elaine. She was a lesbian Sicilian psychiatrist at the high school. Oh, she absolutely hated my guts. And then I remember when we were having discussions as colleagues, if structured formally, about what was it, the No Child Left Behind Act, and they were using that as a weapon against the teachers. And there's a lot of moaning about, well, how can they do this to us? This is so mean and bad. And I was like, well, okay, so refuse the funding. Refuse the federal funding, go your own way, or don't discuss it. If you're not going to organize and force through an action and a position, then stop complaining. And this bitch Elaine, the way she acted in these discussions, it was like she was a collaborator. She was like, oh well, just got to go along with it. And that's the sort of bitch scumbag I absolutely would not want in charge of deciding who gets locked up, right? The soft cop. So many of these Karens are they're sociopaths, and they come from a background of the Mafia, the fascists. My department chair, Karen, was a right wing anti-communist bohawk, and they just outlawed the Communist Party in Czechia. And so many people, I had an associate in my CIA socialist group who was Czech Jewish, and he's now a tenured professor in Prague of history. And, he was one of the more thoughtful ones. But, another one, he was Bohawk. He became director of labor notes, this a group affiliated with Solidarity, a CIA socialist organization. And, these people in America are everywhere. And, even Melania Trump, as a Slovenian, Yugoslav, who came to the U.S. under, questionable circumstances. But, she was Yugoslav enough to kick these Ustasha Croatian filth out of the White House. Because they were so aggressive and nasty towards her. The first lady of the USA, these fucking Ustasha filth are so entitled and nasty that they start attacking her. And she's like, okay, get the fuck out. And so, she's quite right that, to say that to that filth. But that's the problem, is that filth is into the institutions of America all over. And I've had experience with that kind of filth myself in Budapest. And I did some of the math and talked to the archivists in Celje, Slovenia, where apparently my great-grandparents were from on one side. And the archivist there was like, oh yeah, the Hungarians, they're fascist Huns. And I was like, yeah, I believe you. In my experience, they're fascist Huns. The ones that call themselves liberal, as Malcolm X once noted, they're even worse. Because you think, you can work with them, but oh no, they're just the sneakier Nazis. The gay liberal Nazis. Who will shoot you in the back, basically. In my experience, that's what happened to me. When I visited Budapest, they were just the worst of the worst of the worst. And then their counterparts, the grandparents' generation came to Hitler Freedom Land, and they fit right in, and they went right into positions of authority in the U.S. That was my experience in Chicago. Commissioner of Aviation, Jamie Rhee, Korean Nazi whore, fuck the mayor, got her job illegally. Some Ukrainian banderovtsi filth at the Water Management Department, became contracts administrator. Who else? I'm sure, they're all over. The Sicilian filth at Evanston Township High School, couldn't stop insinuating that I was like, oh, you're a child molester. You're a sexist. You have a penis. I hate you. You remind me of my Uncle Guido, who probably was a child molester or some criminal. But lady, no. I actually grew up around Stalinists and had some fucking sense and morality. I was fucking Honor Scout 1984, bitch. I'm not some fucking filthy mafia dago from your shitty neighborhood, that you're having PTSD about, and you want to go, ape shit crazy on me because of your fucking Uncle Guido, the mobster, fuck off. So, that's the problem in America, is garbage in, garbage out. I'm very wary of giving, in Russia or in Belarus more so, you can they're more authoritarian on the surface than the U.S. is, yeah. But when you go to the U.S., there's this false kind of veneer of, oh yeah, hey, America, hot dogs, freedom. I met this bimbo at a bar in St. Petersburg, where all the neighborhood where all the strivers went and the migrants went. Awful. Parnas. And the Woodpecker Bar. And there's this young, sexy babe, artist, liberal, hates Putin, hates the Russian government, telling me her friend lives in Los Angeles, has, a wonderful life, loves America, loves Los Angeles. I'm like, oh, really? So how old is she? She's in her 20s. Is she hot? Yeah, she's hot. And so she's liberal. She's like a master of the universe, fits right in with all the degenerates and freaks in Los Angeles and the liberals. And, so her life is great, but, in Russia, the majority of the population is like, oh, you're a liberal, you're a shiny, happy master of the universe. Fuck off. Get the fuck away from me. And if you touch my fucking apartment and my health care, such as it is, and the transportation and any of the basics, I'm going to put a rope around your neck and put you up on the fucking lamppost. That's the sort of attitude, like, well, subconsciously, semi-consciously, or not even, that people in Russia have, right? Um, yeah. So, or just a fear and distrust of outsiders, which is healthy. Whereas in America, it's like, hey, buddy, how you doing? Yeah, I had coworkers like that, just friendly sociopaths out to stick the knife in you. Um, and yeah, those kind of people, I can't wait until the manure contraption collapses and we start shooting them. They're just the absolute scum of the earth. One in particular, oh God, he worked in Dick Durbin's office. He was that bad. Dick Durbin is the head of the political mafia in Illinois, one of the worst states in the Union. Although, a shithole like South Carolina, I'm sure, gives Illinois a run for its money and probably surpasses it in nastiness. But anyway, so yeah, all that to say, yeah, there is a big problem on the streets of America with homelessness, but a lot of that is just due to the fact that the Hitlerites that run Hitler Freedom Land have fucked up the society so badly, that not even the basics are provided, to the population. So, and the, just degeneracy that's displayed, everywhere in America from the top down. There's no sense of propriety or like, honesty or trustworthiness. Yeah, everything is to be, it's all about lying, cheating, and stealing. It's awful. Now, I'm crazy enough to go back there, but, part of it is just, I spent most of my life there, and, I'll just live, sort of, what do they call that? Like, I'm a retiree, and, I'll live driving around like people do in RVs, except I'm going to do it in, a gigantic SUV or a van, outfitted, that I'm going to have outfitted professionally. And, I to pay rent to these bloodsuckers, that's the other thing is a lot of these homeless people in a normal country like Belarus, they would have a house. Homelessness is very low. Belarus is more equal than Cuba is. And that's where you get that kind of beautiful atmosphere of, the 70s and the Soviet Union. Our people in Belarus, we have an idea of what, a society is because, the antithesis of that, the liberals and the Nazis who came to our country and murdered my whole fucking family in 1941, practically, except for, I think, 2 individuals. And wiped out, probably, a third to a half of the town, most of it wiped out in one day. The people of Belarus know what you freaks in the West are about. Yeah, and more and more, even the stupid ones in the East, if they experience America, they see the homelessness or they experience a health problem and, they go into bankruptcy and maybe they flee, or like these Chinese students in Ann Arbor in this bullshit dormitory complex owned by these, fucking rich Jews with money who are charging us $1,200 a month to live in a fucking dorm room. They left the water on in their, little shit apartment and they walked out. They destroyed their whole fucking apartment and took a plane back to China as a fuck you to these sociopaths, and that's what America is, and so in a way, someone like Luigi or Shane to shoot these bastards, it's a rational response to an absolutely batshit crazy system. Yeah, and that's the problem is you have absolutely batshit immoral criminal Nazi scum deciding who should be locked up, and there's a big problem. in terms of, people who become drug addicts, either by choice or by alienation, or, yeah, because a lot of drug addiction is based on, I've got no community. The community around me is just dysfunctional and sociopathic. So, yeah, and I'm stupid, so let me experiment with drugs and living on the streets. Okay, that's stupid. But then you're going to put people who are basically gay liberal Nazis from Mafia backgrounds, or, fascist Asians, or fascist Eastern Europeans in charge of deciding who's sane and who's crazy and who should be locked up. That's really dangerous. Yeah, I guess basically that's the point. Yeah. I mean, the Stalinists, they would use psychiatric detention against liberals, back in the 70s. But at the same time, the societies they ruled over were much more, much more rational and just and civilized than the savagery you see in the West. And now, yeah, the Nazis and gay liberal Nazis, to put them in charge of just deciding who should be locked up and who, should remain free. That to me, yeah, that is dangerous. Something has to be done with the homeless, but I think a lot of it too should be, basically shoot and expropriate and lock up the housing speculators. But, in America, in Hitler Freedom Land, is that going to be done when the whole country is modeled after, lying, cheating, stealing, murdering? Yeah, good luck with that, huh?